Tom Hartman. America now on the verge of refighting the American Revolution? ? Former Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney being booed in his own home state raises an urgent question. Are the Redcoats back? The Republican Party has now introduced over 300 pieces of legislation designed to make it more difficult for American citizens to participate in the process of selecting their representatives, which is the core function of a democratic republic. They've also proposed or passed numerous laws criminalizing protest and dissent, primary American values written into the First Amendment. And they have given a so-called get-out-of-jail-free card to people who kill protesters. Today's Republican Party does not believe in democracy or the core idea on which this nation was founded. And that is, quote, that all men are created equal, they're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, and, quote, that to secure those rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, end quote. As we see with their support of Trump's big lie, they have a serious problem with that consent of the governed part of the Declaration of Independence. And they're pretty sketchy about the whole human rights thing. If it seems like America is refighting the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, it's because there is a sizable group of right-wing Americans who say that's what they think they're doing. In both of those past wars, one group of Americans believed in the ideal of democracy and a republic deriving its authority from the will and consent of its people. On the other side, there were people who believed that democracy was a dangerous experiment and a grave mistake. During the Revolutionary War, the anti-democracy folks were called Tories or Loyalists, because they were loyal to the British king and believed that the best form of government was a kingdom, and that letting average people participate in democratic governance would lead to disaster. That was solidly a third, perhaps even half, of the white people then living in North America. They were willing to fight and die to keep America part of the United Kingdom. Those who opposed democracy on this continent had a lot of history on their side. For most of the 7,000 years of recorded human history at that point, governments had been run either by kings who seized power through violence or priestly theocrats who claimed that their authority to rule came from God. And in most cases, regardless of who ended up on top, there was an unholy alliance between the two. The British United Kingdom was just the latest in 1776 in a long series of kingdoms that ruled every part of Europe. The Greek experiment with democracy was 3,000 years old at that time, and the Roman experiment with a republican form of government had failed almost 2,000 years earlier. There were a lot of reasons back then to think that a democratic republic would be a terrible mistake. The main one was that it hadn't worked in thousands of years, and the ancient Greek and Roman experiments were considered by many, most actually, to have been failed experiments. People believed so strongly either in the loyalist necessity of a royal family or the founders' hope of a people engaged in self-rule that families were literally torn apart, brother killing brother, neighbors turning firearms against each other. And by the time of the Civil War, 80 years later, there was still a debate about whether democracy was anything more than some kind of liberal, airy-fairy idea that really didn't work out all that well. But this time, those Americans who took up arms against democracy were not fighting on behalf of a church or a king. They were fighting to support the rich, the oligarchs of the Deep South. As I lay out in detail in my new book, The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, between 1820 and 1860, the South underwent a radical consolidation of wealth and property. The invention of the cotton gin and its adoption in the early 1820s allowed the few plantations wealthy enough to buy one to effectively wipe out their smaller competitors and buy up their land. And as a result, by 1860, virtually all of the most productive land, wealth, and political power of the South was consolidated in the hands of just a few thousand families. They didn't believe in democracy either. They declared war on America specifically to end democracy and establish a continent-wide oligarchy, ruled by the rich in an oligarchic police state as the South had become. The North won and democracy prevailed, but the idea of oligarchy survived and has been persistent throughout American history. That is what the Republican Party now represents. Oligarchy. Ruled by the rich and ignoring the so-called consent of the governed. The suppression of dissent, the oppression of minorities, and replacing the ballot box with the iron fist of a police state run of, by, and for the wealthy few. And they're pushing us really hard and really fast. For example, a political network run by a group of right-wing billionaires has a larger budget and more employees than the entire Republican Party. A family of billionaire oligarchs from Australia crank democracy-hating propaganda into the American political bloodstream nearly every day on cable television and in print. Voices openly denigrating democracy and promoting hate and intolerance, which are the hallmarks of oligarchy, are on local radio and television in every American city every single day and dominate the internet. The single largest source of threats and murders by terrorists in America are today committed by white supremacist right-wingers who hate and fear the idea of a pluralistic democratic society. And tragically, for the third time in our history, Americans who believe in democracy find themselves again having to defend themselves against Americans who don't. Several of these hard-right groups have openly declared their intentions to start a second American Civil War. They say they want to see Americans killing each other in the name of white supremacy and rule by the rich, and some have followed their suggestion. They declare their loyalty to a white supremacist real estate oligarch from New York, get their news from Australian and Ukrainian oligarchs, and have embraced an ideology championed by Germans in the 1930s. They even adorn themselves in red and wear funny hats like the British loyalists did in revolutionary times. The Biden presidency represents America's third and perhaps final chance to prove democracy is not merely an idealistic fantasy. If his administration and the Democrats in Congress can succeed in conquering the coronavirus, putting the American economy back on track, and rebuilding the civil society that 40 years of Reaganism has so devastated, then American democracy, and indeed democracy around the world, may well endure and even grow. But Republicans are doing everything they can to keep that from happening, from discouraging vaccination and public health measures, to sabotaging our election systems, to amplifying their rhetoric of hate and terror across multiple media platforms. When so-called moderate voices within their ranks, like Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney, dare pop their heads up, the majority of the Republican Party viciously attacks them. Dissent is no longer allowed in the GOP. Authoritarianism has prevailed. Oligarchy has completely seized that party. These, as Thomas Paine said, quote, are the times that try men's souls, end quote. And long before actual conflict broke out, Paine wrote, quote, the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. End quote. We must not let the right-wing, red-coat, red-hat terrorists who have openly proclaimed their goal of Americans killing Americans in an ideological and racial war prevail. Tom Hartman. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcast. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.